Good evening, mates. Welcome to Historian's Lullaby, where fascinating tales from the past receive just the right amount of mellow to help you fall into a deep and heavenly slumber. Tonight, please cozy up to a very bizarre episode from history known as the Dancing Plague of 1518. But before you drift off into the ethereal world of dreams, please let us know in the comments where in the world you are and why you are still awake. Let's begin now. It starts with a single woman. Standing alone in a narrow street, cobblestone slick with summer heat and the refuse of medieval life. Strasbourg, July 1518. The Holy Roman Empire teeters on the edge of Reformation, and in this corner of Alsace, something else is about to break. Her name is Frau Trophia, and she has begun to dance. Not the controlled steps of a wedding celebration, or even the ritualized movements of a religious procession. This is something else entirely. Her body writhes and jerks, her feet pound against stone, her arms flail in desperate, ceaseless motion. Within a week, 34 others have joined her. Within a month, the number will reach 400. They will dance until their feet bleed, until they collapse from exhaustion, until some of them die. This is the story of the Dancing Plague of 1518. But it's also the story of something much larger. A society pushed to its breaking point. A world where the lines between the sacred and the profane, the rational and the mystical, the individual and the collective, have become impossibly thin. Tonight, as we cozy up with our favorite blankets and quilts, we descend into that world. To understand the Dancing Plague, we must first understand the world that created it. And that world, the world of 1518 Strasbourg, was in deep turmoil. Picture Strasbourg as it was 5 centuries ago. A city of perhaps 20,000 souls, crammed within medieval walls that seem to press inward with each passing year. The Rhine flows past like an indifferent god, carrying trade and prosperity to other places while Strasbourg watches from its muddy banks. The year 1518 sits at the confluence of catastrophes. Behind them, the survivors can still taste the ash of apocalypse, famine, disease, war, each bleeding into the next in an endless cycle of suffering. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had been their grandparents' nightmare, 7 years when the rains would not stop, when grain rotted in flooded fields, when the very young and very old simply disappeared. Vanished into unmarked graves or melted away like snow in spring, their bodies unable to sustain the meager rations of bark bread and bitter herbs. But the dead stayed hungry too. The Black Death had followed, as if summoned by the scent of weakness. A third of Europe, gone. In Strasbourg, entire neighborhoods fell silent. Streets that once echoed with the calls of merchants and the laughter of children became processional routes for funeral carts. The living learned to sleep with the stench of death in their nostrils. And yet, they survived. The remnants. The lucky. The stubborn. By 1518, new generations have been born into this scarred world. They know the stories, carry the inherited trauma in their bones. But they also know something else, that survival is not the same as living. Walk through Strasbourg in 1518, and you cannot escape the weight of organized religion. Gothic spires pierce the sky like stone prayers, cathedral bells mark every hour with metallic authority. The church owns perhaps a third of the city's land, and controls education, marriage, and death, the very rhythm of daily life. But something had gone wrong in the house of God. The priest who should offer comfort instead offers fear. From every pulpit comes the same message: you are sinful, you are damned, you are one missed tithe away from eternal torment. Purgatory yawns beneath every footstep, and the only bridge across that chasm is paved with silver coins. Want your dead grandfather's soul released from centuries of suffering? That will cost you. Need forgiveness for the sin of being born? Pay up. Hope to avoid the fires that await all flesh? The medieval church had a price list. Let's explore the scope of this spiritual extortion. In Strasbourg, a working man might spend a full month's wages on a single indulgence. A peasant family could bankrupt themselves purchasing prayers for their ancestors. The poor sold what little they had to buy their way into heaven, only to discover that poverty itself was now being preached as evidence of divine disfavor. The corruption runs deeper still. Local clergy live in luxury while their parishioners starve. Bishops accumulate wealth and political power like medieval CEOs. The sale of church offices, called simony, has turned the sacred into a marketplace where spiritual authority goes to the highest bidder. And yet, the people still believe. They have to believe. Because in a world where earthly life offers little but suffering, the promise of celestial reward is all that stands between them and absolute despair. But what happens when that promise begins to feel like a con game? The rich grow richer. The poor grow desperate. And in between, regular city dwellers watch as the world collapses in slow motion. Strasbourg in 1518 is a city of stark contrasts. In the upper quarters, merchant families live in timber-framed luxury, their tables groaning under imported delicacies, their wardrobes stocked with furs and silks. They speak of trade routes and investment opportunities, of political alliances and strategic marriages. But descend into the lower districts, and you enter another world entirely. Here, in the shadow of those same Gothic cathedrals, families crowd into single rooms. They wear the same clothes until they fall apart, then patch them with whatever scraps can be found. Their diet consists of dark bread, when they can afford bread at all, thin gruel, and whatever can be foraged from the margins of civilization. Let's analyze the mathematical cruelty of it all. A skilled craftsman in 1518 Strasbourg might earn enough to live comfortably, if he stays employed, if he stays healthy, if no economic disruption destroys his trade. But economic disruption is constant. War redirects resources. Plague disrupts commerce. Bad harvests drive up food prices. The result is a population living perpetually on the edge of catastrophe. One bad season, one illness, one political upheaval can transform a respectable burgher into a beggar. This proto-middle class existed in a state of chronic anxiety, always one misstep away from joining the ranks of the truly desperate. And the truly desperate are growing in number. Long pause? By 1518, perhaps a third of Strasbourg's population can be classified as poor. Not just economically disadvantaged, but genuinely destitute. They sleep in alleys and abandoned buildings. They eat food that others would feed to animals. They watch their children grow thin and quiet, and they know there is nothing they can do about it. This is the soil in which the dancing plague will grow. Rich with desperation, fertilized by generations of trauma, watered by tears that no one bothers to count. But we're not there yet. First, we need to understand the final ingredient in this toxic mixture. The thing that will transform individual suffering into collective madness. The power of belief itself. In the medieval mind, the boundary between the physical and the spiritual does not exist. Every ailment has a supernatural cause. Every cure requires divine intervention. And every saint has their specialty. Saint Vitus occupies a particular niche in this celestial bureaucracy. A young man martyred in Roman times, he has somehow become the patron saint of dancers, actors, and, most relevantly, those afflicted with certain neurological disorders. But here's where the medieval worldview becomes dangerous. The same saint who can cure unwanted movement can also cause it. In the folk religion of 1518 Strasbourg, St. Vitus is both healer and punisher. Cross him, ignore him, fail to show proper respect, and he might curse you with his dance. Your body will move against your will, controlled by forces beyond human understanding. This belief system creates its own reality. In a world where everyone knows that St. Vitus can compel dancing, the suggestion becomes prophecy. The expectation becomes experience. But St. Vitus is not alone in the medieval pantheon of neurological patron saints. There's St. Anthony, who governs ergotism and epilepsy. St. Dymphna, who watches over the mentally ill. St. Cornelius, protector against seizures. Each of these saints operates according to the same terrifying logic. They can heal what they also have the power to inflict. This creates a religious ecosystem built on fear. The saints are not benevolent guardians but capricious supernatural forces who must be constantly appeased. Forget to light a candle, miss a feast day, commit some minor transgression, and divine punishment will be swift and visible. Your body will betray you, and everyone will know why. But there is another kind of dancing in medieval culture. A dance that everyone knows, that appears on church walls and in illuminated manuscripts, that haunts the collective imagination of Christian Europe. The danse macabre. The dance of death. Picture it, skeletons in tattered robes, grinning skulls crowned with decay, leading an eternal procession that includes every level of society. Popes and peasants, merchants and beggars, all dancing their way to the grave in an endless, egalitarian ballet. This is not entertainment. This is theology. The dance of death served as a constant reminder that worldly distinctions were meaningless, that rich and poor alike will face the same final judgment, that death is always watching, always waiting, always ready to tap you on the shoulder and invite you to join the dance. In 1518 Strasbourg, images of the Danse Macabre were everywhere. Painted on church walls, carved into stone facades, illustrated in books of hours. Citizens see these images daily, absorb their message through constant repetition. Death dances. Dancing leads to death. The association is hardwired into the medieval psyche. But there's something else embedded in these images, something that is crucial to understanding what happens next. The dance of death is portrayed as involuntary. The participants don't choose to dance, they are compelled by forces beyond their control. This creates a cultural template for understanding involuntary movement. When someone begins dancing against their will, medieval observers had a ready-made explanation: supernatural compulsion. Divine punishment. The dance of the damned made manifest in the world of the living. The stage is being set. The props are in place. Soon, someone will step into the spotlight and begin to dance. Pause. Social contagion is not a modern phenomenon. Humans have always been susceptible to mass psychogenic illness, conditions that spread not through biological infection but through the much more mysterious vectors of suggestion, imitation, and shared belief. Medieval Europe provides the perfect laboratory for studying such phenomena. Close-knit communities where everyone knows everyone. Shared religious beliefs that make supernatural explanations not just plausible but inevitable. High levels of stress, malnutrition, and social instability that make people more susceptible to psychological contagion. Add to this the medieval understanding of the human body, not as a biological machine but as a vessel for spiritual forces. In this worldview, your body doesn't really belong to you. It can be possessed by demons, influenced by saints, controlled by cosmic forces beyond human comprehension. This creates what some historians call expectant attention. When the community believes that certain symptoms are possible, expected even, they become more likely to manifest. The belief creates the reality. But social contagion requires more than just susceptible individuals. It needs a trigger event, a patient zero, someone whose symptoms are dramatic enough to capture communal attention and believable enough to serve as a model for imitation. It needs someone like Frau Trophia. We don't know much about her. Historical records from 1518 Strasbourg are frustratingly sparse when it comes to individual biographies. But we can make educated guesses based on social patterns. She was likely poor, or recently impoverished. Probably middle-aged, old enough to have experienced multiple catastrophes but young enough to have survived them. Perhaps recently bereaved, or facing some personal crisis that had pushed her past the breaking point. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of person you might expect to crack under the pressure of living in late medieval Europe. But when she cracked, she didn't collapse inward into depression or madness. Instead, she exploded outward into movement. Her breakdown became performance, her private pain transformed into public spectacle. And in a world where everyone knew that St. Vitus could compel unwilling dancers, her movements were immediately recognizable as something more than mere madness. They were a sign, a portent, a message from the realm beyond. The question was, what was that message, and who else was meant to receive it? July 1518. The summer heat lies heavy on Strasbourg's cobblestones like a physical presence, pressing down on the narrow streets, turning the air thick and oppressive. In this heat, people move slowly, conserving energy, seeking shade. But Frau Troffea has begun to dance. The first witnesses didn't know what to make of it. A woman, alone in the street, her body moving in ways that seem both purposeful and utterly out of control. Her feet stamp against the stones in no rhythm that makes sense. Her arms swing and jerk as if pulled by invisible strings. Her head rolls and snaps with a violence that suggests pain, but her face shows something else entirely. Ecstasy? Agony? It's impossible to tell. This is not the controlled movement of ritual dance, the kind that might accompany a religious festival or wedding celebration. This is something wilder, more desperate. Her movement suggests someone trying to escape from their own body, to shake off some invisible burden that has settled on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Hour after hour, she continues. Through the heat of midday, into the cooler shadows of evening, past midnight and into the following dawn. When exhaustion finally claims her, she collapses where she stands, only to eventually rise again and resume her terrible dance. Word spreads through Strasbourg's tight-knit neighborhoods with the speed that only genuinely shocking news can achieve. A woman is dancing herself to death in the public square. Come and see. Come and witness. Come and try to understand. But understanding proves elusive. The gathered crowd offers theories, demonic possession, divine punishment, simple madness. Some cross themselves and hurry past. Others linger, fascinated by this display of divine punishment. And a few begin to feel something stirring in their own limbs. A twitch. A tremor. The first subtle suggestion that perhaps they too might be susceptible to whatever force has claimed Frau Troffea. Her dancing is not random or chaotic. It follows patterns, suggests structure. To medieval observers, this looks like choreography, as if she is responding to music that only she can hear, following steps that have been taught to her by an invisible dance master. This perceived intentionality is what transforms her breakdown from mere madness into something that demands explanation. Crazy people act randomly. But Frau Troffea appears to be performing. The question is, for whom? By day 3, Frau Troffea's dance causes something in the social atmosphere of Strasbourg to shift. The first to join her is a woman whose name history has not preserved. She appeared in the square on that third day, her movements initially hesitant, almost apologetic. But within hours, she too is caught in the grip of whatever force drives Frau Trophia. Then comes a third, a fourth. By the end of the first week, more than 30 people have been claimed by the dance. The plague does not spread randomly through the population. It follows the fault lines of Strasbourg's social geography, moving preferentially through certain neighborhoods, certain economic classes, certain demographic groups. The dancers are predominantly women, predominantly poor or recently impoverished, predominantly middle-aged. They are people who have been ground down by the machinery of medieval life, who have reached the limits of their endurance and found those limits exceeded. But they are also people who share a common cultural vocabulary. They all know the stories of St. Vitus. They all recognize the signs of supernatural intervention. They all understand, at some deep level, what it means when a human body begins to move against its owner's will. This shared understanding is crucial. Social contagion requires not just psychological susceptibility but also cultural transmission. The symptoms must make sense within the community's framework of belief. They must be recognizable, imitable, meaningful. The dancing plague spreads because it speaks a language that everyone in 1518 Strasbourg understood. But as the number of dancers grows, so does the community's anxiety. This is no longer an isolated case of individual breakdown. This is something larger, more threatening. A disease that attacks not just the body, but social order itself. The authorities must respond. But how do you treat a condition that seems to exist at the intersection of medicine, religion, and mass psychology? The physicians arrive first, called in by families desperate to understand what has claimed their loved ones. These are learned men, trained in the medical theories of their time, equipped with treatments that have worked for other ailments. They examine the dancers, take their pulses, study their urine. They consult ancient texts and debate among themselves. And they reach a diagnosis that will prove catastrophically wrong. Hot blood, they declare. An excess of the sanguine humor, caused by overheated temperatures and emotional excitement. The cure, according to medieval medical theory, is obvious. The patients must dance until their blood cools, until the excess energy is burned away, until their humors return to proper balance. More dancing. That is the prescription. The city council accepts this medical wisdom and acts upon it. They hire musicians, professional players of pipes and drums, to provide accompaniment for the afflicted. They clear spaces for dancing and construct temporary stages. They turn the dancing plague into an officially sanctioned public spectacle. The results are predictable and horrific. With music to guide them and official permission to continue, the dancers' movements become more frenzied, more sustained, more dangerous. What had been episodic now becomes continuous. What had been private suffering now becomes public theater. And the music, the prescribed cure, becomes a transmission vector for the contagion itself. This official response transformed a contained outbreak into a full-scale epidemic. The hired musicians play not just for the existing dancers but for the growing crowds of spectators. The rhythms burrow into susceptible minds. The melodies provide a soundtrack for breakdown. New cases appear daily. The number of active dancers swells from dozens to hundreds. Streets that should be filled with normal commerce instead echo with the sound of stamping feet, labored breathing, and the relentless pulse of hired drums. The cure has become the disease. The treatment has become the transmission. In trying to heal the dancing plague, the authorities of Strasbourg have instead fed it, nurtured it, allowed it to metastasize throughout their community. By the end of July 1518, perhaps 400 people are dancing themselves toward death in the streets of Strasbourg. And still, the music plays on. What does it look like when a city goes insane? By August 1518, central Strasbourg has become an open-air asylum. The dancing grounds established by the city council throb with constant motion. Temporary platforms creak under the weight of writhing bodies. The air fills with dust kicked up by hundreds of feet, with the sound of labored breathing, with occasional screams of exhaustion or ecstasy or pain. The dancers themselves have begun to organize into something resembling a community. They recognize each other, make eye contact across the chaotic space, sometimes seem to respond to the same unheard cues. Observers report moments of synchronization, episodes where dozens of dancers move in unison as if controlled by a single will. But look closer, and individual tragedies emerge from the mass spectacle. Here is a merchant's wife, reduced to a skeletal figure whose expensive dress hangs in tatters. There, a young mother whose children watch from the crowd's edge, too young to understand why their parent has joined this communion of the afflicted. Testimonies from contemporary observers reveal something crucial. This is not mere random movement. The dancers are performing their suffering, making visible the invisible wounds inflicted by their world. A woman whose husband died in the latest outbreak of plague dances out her grief, her movement suggesting the act of digging, of burial, of desperate resurrection attempts. A man bankrupted by church tithes writhes as if trying to throw off invisible chains, his gestures mimicking the counting of coins, the signing of documents, the emptying of purses. The dancing plague has become a kind of collective therapy session, a public space where private trauma can be externalized, shared, witnessed. But it's therapy with no therapist, catharsis with no resolution, performance with no clear ending. And it's killing people. The official records are sparse, but scattered accounts suggest that by late August, deaths were occurring regularly. Dancers collapse from exhaustion, from dehydration, from heart failure brought on by days of continuous exertion. Their bodies are carried away, and new dancers take their places on the blood-stained platforms. But what about the ones who don't dance? The majority of Strasbourg's population who watched this spectacle unfold, but remain somehow immune to its contagion? They cluster at the edges of the dancing grounds, these witnesses to madness. Some come out of morbid curiosity, others from genuine concern for afflicted family members. A few seem to be testing themselves, exposing themselves to the music and movement to see if they too will be claimed. We can explore the complex psychology of the non-dancers. Many reported feeling the pull of the music, the temptation to join the swaying crowd. But something holds them back, stronger social bonds, perhaps, or different personal circumstances, or simply a different neurological susceptibility to mass contagion. They become inadvertent anthropologists, these watchers. Their accounts provide our clearest window into what the dancing plague actually looked like, how it functioned as a social phenomenon. The movements are not random, writes one observer. They follow patterns that repeat, variations on themes that seem to emerge from the dancers collectively rather than individually. It is as if they share a common dream, and are acting out its contents in the waking world. Another notes the apparent communication between dancers. They look to each other for cues, respond to gestures and expressions. There is a language being spoken through their bodies, a conversation conducted entirely in movement. But the watchers also document the horror. The growing number of collapsed bodies. The blood seeping through dancers' shoes. The moment when exhausted performers fall and are trampled by those still in the grip of the compulsion. Some of the watchers began to question the official response. If this is hot blood that needs cooling through exercise, why do the dancers seem to grow more frenzied rather than more calm? If this is a medical condition, why does it respond so clearly to social cues? A few brave voices suggest alternative explanations. Perhaps this is not a physical ailment but a spiritual crisis. Perhaps the prescription of more dancing is not healing but harmful. Perhaps the authorities have misunderstood everything about this plague. But their voices are drowned out by the drums, overwhelmed by the official certainty that medicine has provided the correct response to this unprecedented crisis. By September 1518, Strasbourg is no longer a functioning city. Commercial activity has ground to a halt as the growing dance floor consumes the central squares. Families have been torn apart by the plague's selective recruitment. The city council meets in emergency session, trying to understand how their prescribed cure has become an unstoppable catastrophe. And then, as suddenly as it began, the official response changes. The physicians are dismissed. The hired musicians are sent away. The dancing platforms are dismantled. In their place come priests, bearing holy relics and offering prayers. This is not an admission that the medical diagnosis was wrong. Officially, the authorities maintain that the dancing was indeed caused by overheated blood. But privately, they have reached a different conclusion. This plague is beyond the reach of earthly medicine. It requires supernatural intervention. The dancers are loaded onto carts and transported out of the city, to the shrine of St. Vitus on a hilltop south of Strasbourg. Here, they will be closer to the saint who has allegedly caused their condition. Here, they can seek forgiveness for whatever transgression has brought this punishment upon them. The journey itself is traumatic. Many dancers have been moving continuously for weeks. Their feet are raw, bleeding stumps. Their bodies are skeletal from dehydration and malnutrition. Loading them onto carts and transporting them over rough medieval roads inflicts additional suffering on people who have already endured more than should be humanly possible. But something happens at the shrine. Away from the crowds, the music, the urban environment that has sustained the outbreak, the dancers begin to recover. One by one, they stop moving. They collapse into exhausted sleep. They wake up weak, confused, but free from whatever compulsion had controlled them. There might be multiple factors in this recovery. The change of environment disrupts the social dynamics that had sustained the contagion. The absence of music removes an important trigger for the dancing behavior. The religious ritual provides a face-saving explanation for recovery. The saint has forgiven them, lifted his curse, restored their bodily autonomy. By October 1518, the dancing plague was over. The survivors trickled back to Strasbourg, attempting to resume their normal lives. The dead are buried with whatever ceremony their families can afford. The city council commissions commemorative artwork and institutes new religious observances, as if the proper rituals might prevent such an outbreak from recurring. But questions remain. What really happened during those summer months? How did individual suffering transform into collective madness? And what does the dancing plague reveal about the world that created it? Modern medicine has a name for what happened in Strasbourg: mass psychogenic illness. Also known as mass hysteria, epidemic hysteria, or mass sociogenic illness, a condition where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through a population via social transmission. It's more common than you might think. Factory workers who simultaneously develop mysterious breathing problems that have no identifiable chemical cause. School children who break out in unexplained rashes during exam periods. Entire communities that report strange smells or sounds that modern instruments cannot detect. We may place the dancing plague within this broader category of human behavior, but also identify what made the 1518 outbreak unique in its scope and intensity. First, there was the perfect storm of social conditions. A population under extreme stress from poverty, disease, and social upheaval. A religious framework that made supernatural explanations not just plausible but inevitable. A cultural tradition that linked involuntary movement to divine intervention. Second, there was the specific trigger of Saint Vitus and the dancing saints. Medieval Europeans didn't just believe that saints could cause illness, they had detailed, specific expectations about what that illness would look like. The dancing plague followed a script that everyone already knew by heart. Third, and most crucially, there was the official response that turned treatment into transmission. By prescribing more dancing as the cure, the authorities created optimal conditions for social contagion. The hired musicians provided auditory triggers. The public platforms created social pressure. The official sanction removed normal inhibitions against bizarre behavior. But let's go deeper than just cataloging the conditions that made the plague possible. Let's examine what the dancing actually meant to the people who participated in it. This was not random pathology. It was communication. The dancers were using their bodies to speak truths that could not be expressed in words within their society's constraints. What were the dancers trying to say? Look at who they were: predominantly women, predominantly poor, predominantly members of the social groups with the least power, the smallest voices, the most constrained options for expressing dissent or despair. In medieval Strasbourg, these people had no vote in city council, no voice in religious hierarchy, no means of challenging the systems that oppressed them. They could not question the church's financial demands, could not protest their economic exploitation, could not openly express their rage at watching their children starve while others feasted. But they could dance. The dancing plague became a form of embodied protest, a way of making visible the invisible torture of their daily existence. Through their writhing, bleeding bodies, they testified to suffering that was otherwise ignored or dismissed. Consider the specific gestural patterns that recur among the dancers. Movements that mime the counting of coins, the signing of contracts, the performance of back-breaking labor. Other gestures that suggest supplication, pleading, desperate prayer to unresponsive deities. This was not madness but meaning-making. Not pathology but protest. The dancers had found a way to speak that could not be silenced, could not be dismissed, could not be ignored. And crucially, it was collective speech. Individual suffering, however extreme, can be marginalized, pathologized, forgotten. But when hundreds of people simultaneously embody their distress, the message becomes impossible to ignore. The dancing plague forced the entire city to confront what it had been systematically overlooking, that large segments of the population were living in conditions of unbearable desperation, that the social and religious systems were failing catastrophically, that something had to change. But of course, nothing changed. Once the plague ended, the same structures of exploitation remained in place. The same economic inequalities, the same religious extortion, the same indifference to mass suffering. The dancers had spoken clearly, eloquently, desperately. But their message was ultimately ignored. The dancing plague of 1518 was not unique. Similar outbreaks occurred throughout medieval and early modern Europe, whenever the same conditions aligned: extreme social stress, appropriate cultural frameworks, and triggering events that activated mass psychogenic illness. There was the dancing plague of Aachen in 1374, where hundreds of pilgrims began dancing in the streets during a religious festival. The outbreak at Schonau Abbey in 1491, where nuns reported being compelled to dance by invisible forces. The epidemic in Metz in 1552, which followed almost the same pattern as that in Strasbourg. Each outbreak followed a predictable cycle. Social stress builds to unbearable levels. A triggering event activates mass psychogenic illness in susceptible individuals. The condition spreads through cultural transmission. Authorities respond with treatments that often worsen the situation. Eventually, changed circumstances allow recovery, and the episode ends as suddenly as it began. But the dancing plagues didn't end with the medieval period. They evolved, adapted to new cultural contexts, found new forms of expression. We entrace this phenomenon forward through history. The convulsionaires of 18th century Paris, who writhed in religious ecstasy at the tomb of a Jansenist deacon. The Kentucky Revival of 1801, where thousands of frontier Americans were seized by uncontrollable shaking, dancing, and bizarre vocalizations. The laughing epidemics that swept through East African schools in the 1960s. In each case, the same underlying dynamics, populations under stress, cultural frameworks that make certain symptoms meaningful and transmissible, triggering events that activate collective breakdown. And today? In our supposedly rational, scientific age, do we still dance when the music becomes unbearable? Consider the wave of mysterious illnesses that swept through teenage girls in Leroy, New York in 2011, unexplained tics, verbal outbursts, and movement disorders that spread through social networks and social media. Or the sonic weapon attacks reported by American diplomats in Cuba and China, symptoms that may have been very real but had no identifiable physical cause. We no longer blame St. Vitus for our collective breakdowns. But we still break down collectively, still use our bodies to speak truths that our societies refuse to hear, still dance our desperation in the public squares of the modern world. The music changes. The dance steps evolve. But the fundamental human need to embody suffering, to make invisible pain visible through physical expression, that remains constant across the centuries. So what does the dancing plague of 1518 teach us about human nature, about society, about the relationship between individual suffering and collective madness? First, it reveals the fundamental sponginess of human consciousness. We like to think of ourselves as individual, autonomous beings, but the dancing plague demonstrates how readily we absorb the emotions, behaviors, and even physical symptoms of those around us. In moments of extreme stress, the boundaries between self and other become permeable. One person's breakdown becomes a template for everyone else's. Individual pathology transforms into collective experience. This is not weakness or irrationality. It's a basic feature of human psychology, an evolved capacity that usually serves us well, allowing for empathy, cooperation, shared learning. But under the right conditions, it can also facilitate mass contagion of destructive behaviors. Second, the dancing plague illuminates the power of cultural belief to shape physical reality. The dancers weren't faking their symptoms. Contemporary accounts make clear that they were genuinely unable to stop moving, genuinely suffering, genuinely trapped in patterns of behavior that felt imposed from outside. But those patterns were culturally specific. They danced because their society had taught them that supernatural forces could compel dancing. In a different cultural context, the same underlying psychological distress might have manifested as different symptoms entirely. This suggests something profound about the relationship between mind and body, between belief and biology. Our physical experience is always filtered through cultural interpretation. What we expect to feel influences what we actually feel. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the dancing plague demonstrates how societies create the conditions for their own breakdown. Medieval Strasbourg didn't just happen to be struck by a random epidemic, it generated that epidemic through its own internal contradictions. The extreme inequality, the religious exploitation, the systematic indifference to mass suffering, these weren't just background conditions that made the plague possible. They were the plague's actual causes, its real content, the message that the dancers were trying to communicate through their writhing bodies. The dancing plague was not a mysterious disease that struck Strasbourg from outside. It was Strasbourg's own toxicity made manifest, its structural unfairness transformed into spectacular symptom. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question: what are we dancing today? Look around at our current moment. Record levels of anxiety and depression, especially among young people. Social media platforms that amplify emotional contagion and behavioral mimicry. Conspiracy theories that spread like viruses through populations primed by economic stress and social isolation. Mass shootings that follow predictable patterns of cultural transmission. Suicide clusters that ripple through communities connected by digital networks. Political movements that seem to operate more through emotional contagion than rational discourse. Or the fashion trend aspect of non-binary. Are these the dancing plagues of our time? Modern research suggests they might be. The same fundamental dynamics that drove the 1518 outbreak, like social stress, cultural frameworks that make certain behaviors meaningful and transmissible, technological systems that facilitate rapid spread, are all present in contemporary society. We have our own version of St. Vitus, the algorithmic systems that govern social media, the invisible forces that shape what we see, what we feel, how we respond. We blame the algorithm when our teenagers develop eating disorders from Instagram, when our relatives disappear down YouTube rabbit holes, when our communities tear themselves apart over manufactured outrage. Unlike the medieval authorities who prescribed more dancing as a cure for the dancing plague, we often respond to digital contagion by prescribing more digital engagement. More content moderation, more online education, more technological solutions to technological problems. More donning of new, fashionable gender expressions. But what if the real problem isn't the technology itself but the social conditions that make us so susceptible to technological manipulation? What if our various modern plagues are trying to tell us something about the world we've created, its inequalities, its spiritual emptiness, its systematic failure to provide meaning and security to vast numbers of people? What if we're dancing our desperation just as desperately as Frau Troffea danced hers, but we've lost the ability to recognize the dance for what it is? There is no cure for the dancing plague. There never was. Oh, individual outbreaks end when social conditions change, when cultural attention shifts, when the specific triggers that activated the contagion are removed. But the underlying susceptibility remains, waiting for the next perfect storm of stress and suggestion. This is because the dancing plague isn't really a disease. It's a symptom. It's what happens when societies push their members past the breaking point and then fail to provide adequate means of expression for that extremity. The real cure would require addressing the conditions that make such outbreaks possible: the inequality, the exploitation, the spiritual bankruptcy, the indifference to human suffering. But those changes threaten the very structures that create and maintain power in stratified societies. So instead, we get management, crisis response, damage control. We wait for each outbreak to burn itself out, then return to business as usual until the next one begins. In Strasbourg, after the dancing plague ended, the city council commissioned artwork commemorating the event. Paintings and sculptures that depicted the outbreak as a supernatural visitation, a test of faith, a reminder of human frailty. What they didn't commission was any serious examination of why it had happened. Any investigation into the social conditions that had made their city so vulnerable. Any reforms that might prevent future outbreaks. The dancers had spoken clearly about what was wrong with their world. But their message was transformed into art, ritual, memory, anything except actual change. And perhaps that's the most chilling lesson of the dancing plague. Not that societies can break down, but that they can break down so spectacularly, so publicly, so eloquently, and still learn nothing from the experience. The dance ends. The music stops. The platforms are dismantled. But the conditions that created the dance remain unchanged, waiting patiently for the next time the music becomes unbearable, and someone else begins to move. We return, finally, to that street in Strasbourg. July 1518. A single woman, beginning to dance. But now we understand what we're seeing. Not madness, but meaning. Not pathology, but protest. Not an individual breakdown, but a collective breaking point made manifest in human movement. Frau Trophia dances alone, but she is not alone. She carries within her body the accumulated weight of her entire society, its cruelties and contradictions, its promises and betrayals, its systematic failure to provide dignity and hope to all its members. Her dance is their dance. Her suffering is their suffering. Her desperate movement is their voiceless scream given form and motion. 500 years later, we are still dancing. In different streets, to different music, with different steps. But the fundamental rhythm remains the same, the rhythm of human beings pushed past their limits, using their bodies to speak truths that their societies refuse to hear. The dancing plague of 1518 ended. But the dance, the eternal dance of suffering and protest, of breakdown and meaning-making, of individual bodies bearing collective pain, that dance never ends. It only waits for the right conditions, the right music, the right moment when someone decides they can't remain still any longer. And then, inevitably, the dancing begins again. Thank you for listening to Historian's Lullaby. May you now sleep soundly and wake tomorrow feeling refreshed and knowledgeable about the dancing plague of 1518. Please like, subscribe, and share with someone who also desires to fall asleep listening to weird tales from history. Good night.